Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Sports Bazaar with me, Mick Roy, of course, and doing all the heavy lifting. Once again, it's Titus O'Reilly. You really do, don't you? You bring it every week.
Well, no, we all know you deep down. We've said this often. You do the real research, but I love to be able to pass it on.
Don't lift the skirts. don't let them see how this really operates. I'm just happy to help. What are we doing? Now, this, correct me if I'm wrong, we're in fresh territory, virgin territory.
New series, new
start.
start.
A new series.
I think there's going to be a new series. There's a lot to unpick here.
So, what are you thinking? 1 app, 2 apps, 3 apps?
Maybe 3, maybe 4.
We'll
see.
All right, here
We'll
we
see.
go.
It depends how deep I want to go into this.
You got any hints?
Well, I'll tell you right now because I think you're going to like this. This is a sport we have not done before.
Okay.
So this is one that we have not done before, and it is the sport of NASCAR.
Okay. Right, I'm in.
Which is
NASCAR. I love motor racing.
Yep.
NASCAR's always been the hardest one for me to connect to.
Yeah, this will connect you.
Just seems to be like a very
let me for those
samey.
So before people stop the podcast, if you're not into NASCAR, don't worry, because this is okay. Like all the times we do stories. That's the stories around it that is the funniest. And NASCAR has an hilarious history, because let's start with what NASCAR is. Let's assume someone knows. I know you know it and I know it, but let's assume someone knows nothing about motorsports beyond a cursory glance. So NASCAR, predominantly an American sport. It is started predominantly in the South.
It's a southern
sport.
Yes.
You know, now you might know it from where it's broken through into popular culture is obviously Days of Thunder, Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman,
yes,
or Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby, Will Ferrell.
Sure.
So that gives you a sense of that is NASCAR. So it is like, if you're in Australia, it's like supercars. What we're talking is stock car racing.
Yeah.
Which means stock car means you take a car that is a stock standard car, like a car that someone could go in and buy.
Mass-produced car.
A mass-produced car can go and drive on the road. Of course, they then strip it out and do it up and all that sort of stuff. But it is nominally, they call it stock car racing. It nominally looks like a normal car. It's also closed wheel. It's not open wheel like Formula One or IndyCar, where you look at a Formula One car and the wheels are not covered. It's very low to the ground and all that. NASCAR, you're driving something like that looks like an actual car.
Like your mum's car.
The road.
It's been really souped up.
Souped up, basically, right? So that's what it is. NASCAR stands for...
You pimped out your mum's car.
Yeah, you have. Just made it so it is as light and as powerful as possible, basically.
It's done over quite a length of time. They're usually, what are they, 500s,
1,000s? Might be, it's often, they have street circuits occasionally.
Do they?
Yeah, occasionally now, but mostly they have these big, almost ovals.
It's an oval.
And it's banked, so it goes up the side. So you basically might do 500 laps. So it's a semi-bit of endurance.
And it'll be won by a fender.
And often be won very close. And people who love it, love it. It is fanatical in America.
Yeah.
Absolutely huge. Let's give you a sense of it. So NASCAR stands for the National Association of Stock Car Auto Racing. Yep. So that's where it comes from. It is both an organising and sanctioning body of races.
Yes.
So think of it as like the FIFA of... It's not a sport. The sport, you would argue, is stock car racing. It's the FIFA... What FIFA is to soccer or football, NASCAR is. But it also owns quite a lot of tracks as well, organises them all. So it's quite big. It does 1,500 races at over 100 tracks in 48 US states. Some are some and occasional races in Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and Europe. But it's really very unlike Formula
One. It's by far
One.
the premier racing. In the States. It's the only real
exactly. Well, Formula One's trying to push in on it now, and Formula One has the international. NASCAR has the states. To give you a sense of how big it is in the states, they just signed a 7-year domestic, just in the US, media deals rights with Fox Sports, NBC, Warner Brothers, Discovery, and Amazon, and they paid a combined $7.7 billion starting in 2025 for the rights.
Unbelievable.
So it's worth a lot of money.
It's big bickies.
Now the thing about this, so this is very American Southern racing. You know, there's been debates up until even very recently about whether you're allowed to fly the Confederate flag They only banned that in the last sort of 5 years, I think it was like. So it's very southern. It's very white as a sport.
Sure.
It's got all these. It's very sort of the American of the anti-establishment, kind of thing. The old South in it. And the thing about it is, for a long part of NASCAR's history, they hid or played down how they actually got started. And that's the story we're going to be telling of how they got started. Now, why this is important is because the way, and this first episode is very much going to be giving the backstory to this before we get into the real characters of it.
It's going to be disturbing?
No, it's more fun and rollicking.
Okay, great.
So, people don't have to, it's not harrowing.
No panic.
No panic. It's bonkers.
All right.
Where NASCAR comes from, its success, its early drivers, mechanics, team owners, the money that paid for the racetracks, the money that set up the prizes, the organising infrastructure, everything of its early beginnings is based in one industry, and that industry is moonshine.
Oh, I'm onto it already.
We'll get into what moonshine is in more detail in a moment, but moonshine, the illicit liquor, which was illegal, and this is what founded and came about discovering NASCAR. And so you can understand why for a long time NASCAR didn't want to really point this out.
He didn't want to go to the black and white footage.
Exactly.
Didn't want to go to the origins of the origin story of NASCAR.
Yeah, they don't want to say like all our early drivers all had criminal records and all our owners had criminal records, all had built their money on these massive illegal booze operations. So we're going to go through all of that, the why, the what, and what we're talking about. You can see already that it's like there's a lot of capers and antics. And a bit like we just finished our SP bookies in Australia.
Yeah.
They banned gambling, the SP bookie. Yeah. This is like if the SP bookies had then all gone and used their ill-gotten gains to finance a sport. Now, they sort of did through horse racing in a way, but it's like if they all went and then go, let's start a new sport.
Sure.
So, to understand this particularly type of motor racing, NASCAR, and the whole southern bit and the whole Americanness of it is there's this thing in America always of you don't tread on me. Don't tell me what to do.
Yes.
Freedom, America, Revolutionary War, you don't tell me how I'm taxed.
Yeah.
The Civil
Stay out of
War,
my business.
Don't tell us how to run our states rights.
Yeah.
Don't tell us to get rid of slavery. All this
very
is
big southern,
very big in southern and all of America really. And to give you a sense, where a lot of this begins is when America for the first time started taxing alcohol. This is where moonshine really comes from as a thing. So in January 1791, George Washington's newly minted as the president. Yeah. They've won the Revolutionary War. And they've got to work out how to pay for it all, because one of the things they agreed to have the compromises to establish a federal government is they said to the states, if you let us become the federal government, we will take all your war debts and they'll become our debts and we'll figure out how to pay it off. So we're essentially... So the states... one of the reasons the states all said, okay, we agree to have a federal government and ratify the Constitution is because they were like, all right, well, you're wiping my credit card debt, basically. Sure. So then Alexander Hamilton, he of musical fame, he says, one way we could claw back some money is to put an excise on spirits distilled within the United States. So we're going to put a tax on alcohol to try and pay off some of this debt. And up until that point, there was no tax on alcohol.
That's how long this has been going on. Yeah, the easiest fix in politics are tax alcohol. Beer up, cigs up. Is the old one you used to after every budget in Australian history. Yeah, that used to be the headline.
Exactly,
beer up, cigs up. So this has been going on since taxation was invented to clip the ticket on alcohol.
That's right, and because it's one that people think they can bring in, and everyone. But you got to remember, back then, no one cared about the health benefit, the health negative side of alcohol. So they just saw it as a naked tax grab, right? Sure. So what happens is, and this gives you a sense of what's going to happen, is when they did this, 400, what they call themselves a whiskey rebellion, rebels, 400 whiskey rebels in Pittsburgh set fire to the home of the regional tax collector. He was the supervisor for the tax collector of the area. So they just went and set his house on fire. Right.
That's good feedback from the electorate.
Yeah, exactly. So then Alexander Hamilton goes to Washington, to George Washington, not the place, but actually to the person, and says, okay, we need to send in the militia. We need to send in. Yeah. And so they send in about 13,000 men. They head down to Pennsylvania. And this is the brand new federal government of the states. This is a real challenge to whether they're going to be able to govern. And they go down and they say, Washington says, if any of you help or lend comfort to the insurgents, you'll be in trouble too. And of course, this ends the Whiskey Rebellion. The rebels just disappear into the background and go, all right, let's go hide. And it's the first test of Washington as president. And he sort of passes it because they arrest a bunch of people, but then he pardons the only two that are actually convicted a bit later on. So he sort of says, he makes it not become a big thing. So then in 1802, Thomas Jefferson, who's then president, gets rid of the tax on whiskey. And then this goes along without any problems for a little while.
Of course it does. He's got rid of the tax on whiskey.
Everyone's happy, right? Then the Civil War happens. And once again, after the Civil War, Congress looks at it and goes, we need to pay off all our debts for the Civil War. Let's do a tax on alcohol. Yeah. But the problem here is now they've got to go and tax the South, who have just lost the war to the North. Yeah. Hate the federal government. Sure. And you're saying we're going to now charge you for the alcohol you produce. Right? And this kicks off a whole new cycle, which leads to NASCAR. All right. What happens is they start bringing in these ones, and they actually create on the back in 1962, just after the war's finished, they set up the tax system that America now has, and they create the Office of Internal Revenue, the IRS. Yes. And so these are all going out, and they're now saying, we're going to start taxing you, and they keep every single year, they up the tax on, like you say, on it. So it goes from $150 a gallon, then it's up to $2 a gallon a year later, and it's going up. And the result of this is the Southerners especially go, we want to keep making booze and not tell the government about it.
We don't want to pay tax.
And they invent, therefore, this is where it becomes moonshine.
Legendary moonshine.
So moonshine's known, and you'll like this. Moonshine, which it's basically a corn whiskey. It's a whiskey made from corn rather than rye or some of the other corn or rye or other grains. It's a corn whiskey. Yeah. So it's known by, I thought you'd like to hear the various other names it's called.
Sure.
The slang
for it.
What
does moonshine mean? Mate, under darkness?
Yeah,
under moon,
we'll get into why it's called moonshine too. But let me give you first the slang, because I think you'll like the slang. So it's known as Mountain Dew, as well as moonshine, it's known as Mountain Dew, Chop, Hooch, Homebrew, Mule Kick, Shine, Sneaky Pete, White Dog, White Lightning, and then it's called Pass Around, Firewater, Stump Water, Skull Cracker, Wildcat, and Ruckus Juice.
Oh, they are all gold.
Ruckus Juice is great.
Sneaky Pete's pretty good.
That's where the term Sneaky Pete originally comes from. That was a name for it.
Anyone up for a jar of Sneaky Pete?
So this
is gold.
So this is all what it's
They're
called
all
originally.
Great names.
They're all great names.
You could own a brewery tomorrow and call it any of those things.
Yeah, exactly. So what it is, it's clear usually. So it looks like, say, vodka or something. It's a clear liquid.
Traditionally comes in bottles with 4 X's on the front.
Yeah, on mason jar, the mason jar, and the mason jars too. So what it is it's usually both clear and it's unaged. So unlike your whiskies that people talk about now, like from Scotland, aged 12. Moonshine is made, instantly bottled and sold, right? Boy. So it is unrefined in a way.
Nasty.
It's pretty, Now what happens is they put corn, sugar and yeast together. They ferment it in a big tank or a pot. And then what they do is the yeast turns the sugar into alcohol, which is the fermentation. I don't pretend to be an exact expert on this. Then they distill it they heat it. And the steam because alcohol turns into steam at a different temperature to water. They can basically boil off the alcohol part of it, which they capture. It steams and then condenses and everything. And they don't age it or anything like that. It's sold as quickly as they can make it, which gives us this very raw, burning thing, right? And they want it to have a quick kick. So you drink some moonshine, you're going to get drunk fast, right?
It's on.
It's doing its business, right? It often you can tell if it's good is because it can hold a bead, so a bubble at the surface will stay intact for a very long time because it's got a very high alcohol content, right? The alcohol is often 100 proof, so 200 proof is 100% alcohol. So you're getting in a sort of, often they think during Prohibition it was at about 75% alcohol. So when
your mezcals in Mexico are up around 40 to sometimes 50.
Yeah. Now legally it's around, if you buy moonshine, you can buy it legally, even in Australia. I was thinking of getting some for you and I for this series, which we might be able to say.
Should have some lying around the office here.
It's about 40% now.
Can we do an episode on moonshine?
Well, that's why I thought next time I couldn't get in time. But
we won't tell the audience. They have to pick.
Which of these episodes. So it's 40% now. It's sold out, but it used to go up to like 75%. So very strong. Hard.
The joke was you could go blind.
You could go blind as well, so we'll get into that too. The reason it was called moonshine is because when they used to have these illegal stills, which you make it in, like you have a still for gin or any spirit, but when you used to make it, you got to get a lot of heat.
Oh yeah.
So you got to burn a lot of wood.
Yeah.
And therefore a lot of smoke goes up. So they would cook it. They would do it at night.
They do it at night and somewhere very private, like in the mountains.
Yeah, exactly. So that was, and so it became known as moonshine because you do it you cook it under the moonshine, you make it under the moonshine. So this was sort of what they're doing it. So and so it would be very high alcohol as well. But they would produce, so there's this clear liquid. You drink it. It is a lot like it's unflavoured in a lot of ways. Now what happens is, people in Prohibition, it leads to really the cocktail mixed drink becoming popular. Right. Because a lot of people want to add something to it to mask the taste, especially if it's not made well. Right?
Hence cocktails.
Hence, that's why cocktails really come on. Now, the thing about it is, it was often, because it was illicit, some people prided themselves on their moonshine and made really good, clean alcohol. Others were a bit less worried. They were in a criminal enterprise and it was just get it out. Yeah. So sometimes they would put things in it to give it more of a wallop, but make it cheaper because sugar was expensive, yeast, everything was expensive. They would use bleach, rubbing alcohol, manure, and even paint thinner.
Manure?
This tastes like...
worst moonshine I've ever had.
So this is where people could go blind from drinking it.
Yeah, okay.
Too high alcohol, but also just impurities in it.
What they put in it?
And in other cases, there would be deaths and stuff because it was like... So it was a bit like you have now occasionally here, like a batch of, some drug, illicit drug is like killing people or something, because it's not regulated like a normal thing was. Mm. Sometimes people would put in, some people would make moonshine would add in sometimes plum. They'd put a plum in the bottle or fruit or something to give it a bit of flavour and colour it slightly. So that was sometimes what they would do.
Would you go back to the same supplier? Is that what would happen? Or
yeah.
Was there that many people doing it?
There was heaps of people doing it, but often there was heaps of people doing it, but two, it was often like there'd be someone who was known as making really good moonshine and they would have their customers, right? So the area we're talking about where this gets started and really kicks off, especially after the Americans pulled...
Alabama.
Well, in the early part, it's because the taxes come on after the Civil War, right? So that's... First, these people, they're horse and cart, and they're trying to get around the tax man. They don't want to pay tax on it, is really what they're doing. And where this is Appalachia. So this is...
Yes. Sounds so beautiful, Appalachia.
Yeah.
Sounds like where are you from? Appalachia.
And it is beautiful to look at, like the physical nature of it. But it is also...
Banjos playing.
Well, it is deliverance country.
Yeah.
All right. So when a lot of people think of this area, now some would argue that's a stereotype that the Southerners believe is not true and over and all that. And you'll see from what we go in when we get into some of these characters
where that stereotype comes from.
Well, a little from column A, a little from column B. You can see both sides. There's a lot of people that are very smart and not like that at all. But there's a lot of people, there's a few other people we're going to get onto, and let's just say there's a lot of inbreeding and there's a lot of appearing in court, their whole family in court regularly, and signing their names with an X in court. There's a lot of that. So a lot of them are leaving school at 8 years old and stuff like that. So it can often be the very rural, poor area. Now, this whole area, Appalachia... So
wear those long underpants with the flap out the back?
Yeah, that's kind of the image you're going to get.
That's what I want from my moonshiners.
So this area, though...
There's your moonshine, flap out the back.
Appalachia is sort of this area where you got the mountains. It's the eastern United States. It goes down from the Catskill Mountains in New York into Pennsylvania. Then you got the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Great Smoky Mountains that go all the way down into northern sort of Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. So the states this sort of covers is Alabama, and we're talking mainly of this area, the southern part of it. So you're sort of getting, below sort of Virginia, West Virginia downwards. But it's sort of Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Maryland to an extent, Mississippi, New York is further up. So the bit that we're worried about is the Moonshine Belt, right? And it becomes known as the Moonshine Belt. And it's the states of the Old South mainly. Yeah. So it is Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and
good moonshine territory.
And Virginia. This is the Moonshine Belt, and I'd add in Kentucky as well. So these are the things now, and this is all the Blue Ridge. These are these big mountains, very forested, hard for people to get into, hard for the feds to really ever oversee it properly. A lot of this sort of stuff.
Don't go canoeing.
Yeah, very exactly. And going right back, the farmers in these mountains, they always, because it's poor, the roads are all dirt mainly, right, and twisty and all this. So to get your corn to market, it was so expensive to get a horse and cart and take it all the way down there that by the time you sell it, you'll have lost money. Yeah. So from the earliest days, what they would do is turn it into alcohol, because then you could ship it. You'd make a lot of profit then because it's not as much to carry. It's cheaper and less to carry in alcohol, and you can sell it for more once you get to the city. It was
in the interest of your corn grower.
Yeah, if you're a corn grower, you could make a profit if it was corn was in the form of alcohol than in raw corn. So that's why they first got into it, right? So once they would do that, they could take 10 times more value as alcohol than as raw corn, basically. So it made sense to turn it in. And so they would do all this. They had wood in the mountain, so it was cheap to burn it all off and to cook this stuff. Mm-hmm. So it was free, basically, back then. And they could hide and all this, so it was perfect for them. And so some of these specific counties in these hills, which we'll come to, these become known as the moonshine capitals of America. So we're talking Dawson County, Cock County in Tennessee. Dawson County's in Georgia, Cock County in Tennessee, Wilkes County in North Carolina, and Franklin County in Virginia. Now, Franklin County in Virginia is like the center of moonshining in Virginia. And a representative of...
The Big Smoke.
Yeah, Big Smoke. And a representative of Standard Brands, which was a company back then, testified in a 1935 trial in Franklin County, Virginia, that the people of the county purchased inordinate amounts of sugar, which is one of the ingredients, but also they bought 70,448 pounds of yeast in a 4-year period, when the city of Richmond, which is the biggest city in Virginia, had only bought 2,000 pounds.
And what are your other uses for yeast?
Exactly. So it was obvious to all what was going on up there, right? So they are, so 2,000 pounds for a whole city, and then they're buying 70,000 worth of it, right? So in Wilkes County,
Nothing going on here.
Yeah, it's just totally. Now in Wilkes County, North Carolina, a guy called Rex White, who goes on to become in 1961 the NASCAR Grand National Championship. He told a story about when he went to North Wilkesboro, which is in Wilkes County in North Carolina, when he was a teenager. He said to a man on the street, he said, "Do you know where I could buy some moonshine?" Right, because he was passing through. He was just a teenager. Yeah. And the man pointed down the street to the local post office and said, "That's the only place you can't buy it." So that's what Wilkes County is like. Now, Wilkes County, they said, particularly on Friday nights, you could literally smell moonshine being made. Like the smell of it in the hills was all persuasive because everyone doing it. One Sunday morning, there was a minister in a small church, and he was delivering a fiery sermon to his flock. And as he nears the end of the sermon, he says, "Lord, send this congregation a sign that you have heard us, that you have heard us." And as the minister says it, a quarter of a mile behind the church, a moonshine still is blown up by the government with dynamite, and the minister says, because it just almost shakes the church he goes, "Lord, we heard you. You don't need to be that loud.
Calm down, Lord."
So this is
steady on, Lord.
Steady on, Lord. So
but just so we're clear, there's other alcohol available.
Well, at this point at the start,
you just have to pay tax on it,
and they just don't want to pay tax.
Rather than go and buy a bottle of properly made thing, we'll rather
bourbon or something.
We'd rather
make our own and not pay tax. Yeah.
Wow,
so this is what's happening early on, in this area, and they just hate the federal government. Also, so this is in the early days of this sort of thing, and so, of course, so this is all the area is the old South, so they hate the federal government. So you send a tax inspector down, they're not thrilled. So this is in the sort of this is up until sort of about the this is from 1860 through to
it's
about
typical antics of the South.
Yeah, up until, and so then you have the end of World War I. So all through that period, it's just avoiding paying tax, and it is also horse and cart and all this sort of stuff, and it's fairly low level. And the people making it's like a family thing. You might have a still out the back. You make it. You make a few gallons, you take it around to family and friends, that's it. You're not even really selling it that much, right? And that's what it is. Now, the thing that changes this immensely is in 1920, of course, America brings in Prohibition.
Yeah, okay. Now we're talking.
And this is where we're going to get into where NASCAR comes from. So Prohibition, a bit like our banning gambling in Australia in 1906.
Ridiculous.
Made gambling bigger than ever before and put an SP book in every pub. Suddenly moonshine goes from being this like local family thing,
underground kind of thing, to massive.
Yeah. So Prohibition gets up because a bunch of people in America who are basically special interest groups start pushing for, and they have back into the 1800s in America, usually religious bodies and things like that are pushing to ban alcohol.
The judgy ones who want to tell other people how they should live.
Yeah, and what happens in the early, in the lead up to 920 is these various special interest groups, despite not really representing the majority of Americans, get into the positions of power to be able to get Prohibition passed. Now, some of the people who were in it, like, for instance, Frances Willard, she founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They were a very big one, and in schools they got it taught that alcohol was a colourless liquid poison. Abraham Lincoln came out and spoke out against Prohibition.
Good on him.
He was one that said that it strikes at the very principle upon which our government was founded, which is freedom and all this sort of stuff. But it keeps growing. There's the Anti-Saloon League. They're against it. So they hate drinking and saloons because they think this is where the men go and they get drunk and for some good reasons, go home and beat their wives and behave terribly. So they're against it because of that reason.
They're largely religious groups.
Religious groups too are against it. But people like Georgia, he's from Georgia, Ty Cobbs, the baseballer, he hated it. He was for Prohibition. One group that were very for it is the Ku Klux Klan were very for prohibition, because they believe that the blacks got alcohol and then caused problems, is how they put it.
Right.
So they were for a very specific
prohibition
reason.
For black people? Or
well, they just thought it was easier to just ban it all across the board. Okay. But they had very mixed views when it came in because a lot of their members were not thrilled about it.
I thought so.
But officially they were for Prohibition. So you had this weird collection of religious groups, the Ku Klux Klan, then you had various presidents and various things all come out against alcohol.
And this was across the board, not particular to any part of the states?
No, it's pretty much, well, we get into, so what they do is in 1990, state after state start voting in favour, to answer your question, of Prohibition, and Nebraska become the 36th state to say no to it, which means they get federally a 3/4 consensus, which means they can change the constitution to ban alcohol across the whole country. So once they get to 36 states have all voted for, they all ratify and say we want to ban it. That means they can pass the 18th Amendment.
Wow.
Which passes with a 68% supermajority in the House of Representatives and 76% support in the Senate, and was ratified by 46 out of the 48 states. All say we are banning, and they don't ban the drinking of alcohol. What it bans, and it becomes known as the Volstead Act, which is the enabling part of it. They prohibit the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. So technically, you can drink it, which means if you got some in the, some in the back of your house, you can't make it. You can't travel with it, which becomes important. So you can't have it in your car, and you can't sell it. So this is where it comes in. W.C. Fields, the comedian, said when it was passed that he lamented it. Said, "This is terrible. I'll be forced to live for days on nothing but food and water."
Where's the fun in that?
Yeah. So the funny thing about Prohibition, of course, which is not that amazing to people like you and I, but to them was a bit of a surprise, is that Prohibition means that for the people in the Moonshine Belt, production shoots through the roof.
Yeah.
Right? So they suddenly have no legal competitors, and the demand.
Demands.
Everyone wants moonshine because it's a great place to make it because you're up in the hills. The South is not friendly to the federal government, and it's very easy.
You've already got the infrastructure up and running.
Yeah, you got the wood, you got everything you need, all that sort of stuff. And it had been a sort of a family business. Now, bootleggers suddenly go from having like a 40-gallon still to suddenly they get up to like 1,000 gallons. They're just pumping out, and they've got swamps up there and thick forests and everything, so they're just pumping out this stuff. And the US Treasury, who are given policing powers on the revenue side, well, they can't tax anymore, so they've got to change and get people in there to kind of enforce it. The Prohibition agents, they're trying to catch the moonshiners, but they don't have they can't cover this area. This area is unforgiving and huge, and they don't get it right. So in the 20s and 30s, while Prohibition is happening, the number one state for the seizure of stills and arrests is in Georgia. So Al Capone and Chicago get all the attention of Prohibition. Right. But actually it's in places like Atlanta and Georgia and in these hills that a lot of the real battle is going on. In fact, 126 federal agents are killed. Some are gunned down during still raids. One was pushed from a moving car by a moonshiner. One fell into a vat of boiling mash. Another asphyxiated from the fumes of fermenting corn. One agent was maimed by a bootlegger whose brakes failed and slammed into a roadblock. So you're having all this stuff going on all the time. And the moonshiners are also having horrific injuries. One South Carolina sheriff was known to just execute them if he caught them. Yeah. So you're getting you're getting all this crazy stuff kind of happening, right? But because of all this, the one thing that happens is before Prohibition, the way that bootleggers got their money around, their illegal booze around, is horse and cart, and then eventually the Model T Ford comes in.
Right.
They potter around like it's a milk run because it was legal. You could get in trouble for not being taxed.
Yes.
Not paying your tax, basically.
Yeah.
But in terms of taking it around, there was no problem. Prohibition comes in, you can't be caught selling it or travelling with it, transporting with it. So they're suddenly going, right. And this could have been a real problem, except Prohibition coincides with really the mass production of automobiles. So suddenly they've all got cars and they all go, right. So in the Moonshine Belt, the customers know we're up in the hills, but with the roads, if we can get it down to the urban areas of Richmond, Baltimore, Atlanta, Philadelphia, all these areas, it can then be sold in places down there or be taken beyond. Yeah. But we've just got to get it out of the hills. Get it off the mountain. Get it off the mountain and down to this, right? So there was the Georgia Highway, which became known as the Whiskey Trail, and it was covered 60 miles of full switchback curves through mountains. Was it known as
the Whiskey Trail at the time?
It became known at the time as the Whiskey Trail.
That's a kind of giveaway.
Yeah. It would go through all the foothills from Dawsonville, which was a really big centre in Georgia of all the moonshine. They would take it all the way down to Atlanta, and some of the people that get into NASCAR want to become from this, which we'll get into. Then you got the US Highway 421, this is up in sort of North Carolina, and this is all where you've got North Wilkesboro and Wilkes County and all that. It was one that went all the way down to Winston-Salem and Greensboro, and they'd run through that. The term Thunder Road is from a 1958 American drama. People instantly think of Bruce Springsteen's song. It's actually, and Bruce Springsteen got it from seeing this movie poster, and he hadn't actually seen the movie. Thunder Road refers to, in the film's plot, it starred Robert Mitchum, who wrote the story. It's about running bootleg moonshine in the mountains of Kentucky, North Carolina, and Tennessee in the 50s, right? And so it's Thunder Road refers to, we talked about White Lightning was the name. This was about running illegal liquor. That's what Thunder Road actually talks to. So the people that drive these cars become known as the bootleggers or the whiskey trippers. Now, bootlegging, running illegal alcohol, comes from the old American Civil War. People in camp would hide their whiskey down their boot.
Yeah.
This is where it comes from. That's why they're called bootleggers. Now, when Prohibition starts, 3 out of 4 cars are Model T Fords, right? So they're all running it in Model T Fords, which weirdly, Henry Ford was a staunch teetotaler.
He's not happy. He's furious.
He was furious, and they all loved him because his cars were the most popular for all these bootleggers. So every bootlegger could fit about 90 gallons of booze into a Model T. Which was worth $4,000 at the time.
At the time.
The average household income was perhaps $700 a year. So it's a lot of money, right? Now, most bootleggers with the Model Ts, they would look at it and they would go, okay, it needs to look like a normal Model T so the police don't notice it, right? Yeah. But we need to change it a bit. So we need to put false... And the Model T could be used
bottoms,
a bit like a truck and stuff.
Tops, an extra tank.
Yep, they would put a false bottom and put the alcohol underneath, and then maybe put live chickens above it, so it looks like they were taking chickens to market. But underneath,
good luck getting them out if you really want to search the vehicle.
So they were doing all this sort of stuff. Now, in the 1920s, as Prohibition goes on, Henry Ford realizes that people are getting a bit tired of the Model T because he is always arguing, well, but it's cheap and practical. But America's got richer, and they started to want, we want something with a bit of excitement, like. What
do you got?
And the Chevy has come along, and it's starting to look a bit more fancy.
Yeah.
So he comes in, and in 1927, at the height of Prohibition, he brings in the Model A, which if you ever look at, like, Bonnie and Clyde car, that gangster type car, that's the Model A. So he brings that in. The Moonshine runners instantly look at that and go, this is a great car for running moonshine. So they start doing that. And then 5 years after that, as Prohibition comes towards the end, he brings in another model, which is the Ford V8, the first mass-produced V8. There had been V8s before, but he was the one that made it in a massive way. And this becomes the favourite car of the runners. Yeah. Now, to give you an idea how good the V8 was, how fast and reliable, that was very important. Bonnie and Clyde, they would often use a V8 because it was both fast and reliable. And they wrote Clyde Barrows from Bonnie and Clyde. He wrote to Ford in 1933 praising his car. Said, I've driven Fords exclusively when I could get away with one. The Ford has got every other car skinned, and even though my business hasn't been strictly legal, it don't hurt anything to tell you what a fine car you've got in the V8.
What a testimonial from Clyde. You'd put that on the poster.
Yeah. Now, Bonnie and Clyde were shot to death in in one of their cars. So that's a surprise.
Well, that's not in the ad.
They put that bit in the ad. It's a great car to be shot in too. Bank robber John Dillinger, who many people would have heard, he once escaped from an escape-proof jail in Indiana when he stole the county sheriff's new Ford V8. And he liked it so much, he also used a Ford Model A to escape agents in Wisconsin. Now, there is a letter found in the Ford files that says, hello, old pal. Arrived here at 10 a.m. today. Would like to drop in and see you. You have a wonderful car. Been driving it for 3 weeks. It's a treat to drive one. Your slogan should be, drive a Ford and watch the other cars fall behind you. I can make any other car take a Ford's dust. Bye-bye, John Dillinger. Now, people don't know that is true because he was then shot and killed like a few weeks after that. letter was sent. But this is the sort of, where it's coming from. Now, the idea for the moonshine runners is they want to take these cars, they want to make them look as good as possible.
Stock
so they would
cars off the shelf.
And they want them outside to look as normal as any other car. Yeah. But inside they would take out the floorboards, they'd take out back seats, they would do everything to store as much liquor as possible. Yeah. They would install extra suspension springs to handle the weight because if you filled a normal Ford V8 or Model T or Model A with this much booze without fixing the suspension, it would just sink almost to the ground and ride so low that any cop passing would go, they're bootlegging. The other problem they said is you couldn't make the suspension too good because then when you took the booze out, the back would rise up. And they said it raised up like a cat on the heat. So the cops could tell that you were running at even. Yeah. So they would, and the suspension would have to be able to handle going down roads at great speeds, often dust-covered roads, dirt tracks.
Being chased.
And being chased. So they said, right. They would also, so they'd install the extra suspension for that. They'd put a dirt protecting plate in front of the radiator so dirt wouldn't go in and clog it. They'd also put it there so that the police couldn't shoot holes in the radiator and let the steam. That was one way they used to try and stop it, right? So they would do that.
Right.
They often then learned that they needed great tyres. So they would seek out the best tyres because the worst thing you'd want is your high-speed chase and you get a flat. And this all begins, so making the car as reliable and as fast and with the best tyre and everything starts to become an idea of these guys are the best drivers in the best cars and they know everything about it.
With the latest mod cons.
With them, they are doing everything
Souped
right.
Up.
One guy who there becomes a thing known as the bootleg turn, which is where you are driving along at full speed, you see a roadblock up ahead, and you learn doing various things with the handbrake and everything and gears to turn the car 180 without stopping and take off the other way.
Like a slide.
Like a slide and then off. And so they all learn to... So the good ones do that. There was a guy who we'll get into in great detail in a further episode, but Junior Johnson, who goes on to be one of the great NASCAR drivers of all time, he is running booze, and he works out that if he removes the windshield wipers and tapes up the openings around the headlights, he can pick up 10 miles per hour in top speed.
Incredible.
So they start to realise the faster you can go, you can outrun these guys too, right? So they're doing all this. They start importing hot rod equipment from California because they start working out, okay, we can add superchargers, we can change the engines.
Yes.
They start doing all these things to get more and more out of one. One guy brings in a Cadillac ambulance engine and puts it into his Model T V8 to just get extra things right. So they all start to know who the good mechanics are too. So there's all these mechanics who just almost purely work on the sly on bootleggers' cars. So they are just, putting in extra carburetors, better air intake, all this, more power. If I can give you more horsepower, I'll do it. There's apparently one secret garage which was hidden in the woods on the North Carolina-Virginia state line, and it was operated for 35 years by a guy called Jelly Belly. And he was apparently so good that he could build cars that were more powerful than anything else. And Junior Johnson said later, the law enforcement had to use what they could from the dealerships. We'd take the money that we could make from the moonshine business and fix our cars to where we could never lose a car. So he said we just poured the money into improving this, right?
Right.
Some of them would rig their cars to produce clouds of smoke or to drop oil or nails from the rear of cars. So this is like James Bond stuff.
It really is. Push that button.
Yeah. They would do all that. Sometimes they would often travel with a blocker, so a driver who'd run interference between the whiskey car and the revenue chasers or the things. Apparently in these communities, if the cops were around, they would fire a gun or set off dynamite, which through the hills everyone can hear and let everyone know they're about.
Sharp.
Yeah. One moonshiner said he would often get into Atlanta and he'd be sitting there in the morning commute trying to blend in, and if he saw cops near him, he'd begin picking his nose, because he says no one keeps looking at you when you're picking your nose. He figured that out, that when they sort of stopped looking at the car because it was like giving him his privacy. So they were doing all this sort of stuff right. Now, the people trying to catch them, they would design a pincer device that they could attach to the front of the cars that could snag a rear fender, so to stop the car. So the bootleggers then respond by putting on their rear fenders with very loose wire coat hangers, so that if a revenue did get it would come off. It would come off, a bit like a lizard losing its tail if someone catches it, right? So there's this constant going up and down of battle between the pursuers.
Battle of wits.
Yeah. So the other thing that the cops would try and do is they worked out that they put a steel battering ram in the front of their cars when they were chasing them, and they'd try and wait for a bootlegger to be in a curve, and then they'd hit him at an angle and he'd spin out, right? Yes. But bootleggers learned, and the good drivers learned, if they slowed down just a notch, they would wait for the revenue to get close, and just as he's about to ram him, they'd gun it, and that would often send the cops spinning off the road. So they would so the drivers, and this gives you a sense of what the areas are like, and this is one of a former federal agent, tax agent unit agent, Joe Carter. He said once, we lacked another component that they had, and the drivers. These guys could drive a car like you wouldn't believe. By the time they got to be 14 years old, they could outrun any officer I knew. They learned how to drive, and they knew every curve, of the mountains, basically. So another NASCAR legend, Curtis Turner, who did this, he delivered his first load of whiskey in 1934 at the age of 10. He's 10 years old.
There's a reason they're using kids? Or?
Everyone in the mountains just learns to drive in an early thing. Age. And kids, so,
that's what excites
And the whole family usually it's a family business even when. So he said a few miles from home on his first ever run as a 10-year-old, he had 100 gallons of his father's car in an Oldsmobile. He approached a slow-moving mail truck and couldn't remember, do I pass on the left or the right? He could, because he knew how to drive the car. He didn't know the road rules. He said, I chose the right and slid off the road into a fence. So this is how he started. Now, years later, he goes on to be a great NASCAR driver, but years later, he showed off how good he was at doing the bootlegger turn, which is this one where you spin the car at 180. And so he lined up 2 rows of whiskey jars on the road 10 feet apart, sped towards them at full speed, spun 180 degrees and slid backwards between the 2 rows without touching a jar.
Incredible.
So this is what these guys are like, right? NASCAR, another former future NASCAR champion, David Pearson, he learned to hotwire both his dad's and his brother's cars when he was 12 and would joyride everywhere. A guy called Humpy Wheeler, who goes on to be a great promoter and big deal in NASCAR, he said that you got to remember even in the 30s and 40s, the chief of police in these towns, in these mountain towns, knew you, and if they saw you driving about town and knew you could drive, they wouldn't bother you, especially if they knew your dad had sent them to get something or do something. Yeah. So the cops weren't even pulling these guys up, right? Yeah. So you've got all these people, these young kids, driving all the time. They get to know the roads back to front. Yeah. So they know every corner, every road, to the point where they can run them at great speeds with their lights off at night, almost through just pure memory. Yeah. And so the cops chasing them, they got no hope, right? What happens is Prohibition, though, which starts off not popular, as we get into the 30s, it starts to become less popular in every way because, one, criminal activity only increases. Yes. Booze consumption only increases. It's the criminals making the money.
It's not working.
None of the problems have stopped.
All the problems of Prohibition on display.
On display. You've got the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 where a bunch of people, gangsters, are lined up and shot against a wall with two people dressed as... Or there's 4 people, but 2 of them are dressed as police officers. And this is all caught up with Al Capone and all the gangsters, and there's still arguments of who actually committed this. But it was a gang war type situation. People are going, well, not only do we have the problems with Prohibition and alcohol is just as bad as ever, these things are happening in our cities. Yeah. Like, we got to stop this. So the Great Depression's also occurred. And so the government then looks at all this untaxed alcohol and goes, we'd prefer to legalise this and tax it than, let it go all into the criminals.
The government works out how to make money out of something.
Yeah. And they always knew they were losing money by banning alcohol, but when the Great Depression hits, it's even more like, we can't afford to not tax this, right? So they start taxing it. So the 18th Amendment gets repealed in 1933 by something called the 21st Amendment. Now, amazingly, 2 states vote against getting rid of Prohibition, and they are North and South Carolina. And why? Because
they're making a lot of money.
They're making way more money when it's illegal. Or so they thought. What happens is, and in Mississippi, what that act does is, instead of, it doesn't really end Prohibition. What it does is it says it's no longer a federal government decision. It's up to the individual states what you do. So you can have Prohibition or not. Mississippi keeps Prohibition until 1966. The rest all pretty much get rid of it. What does a lot of them do, though, is they can decide, the states, to make certain counties dry. And so a lot of places in these areas keep counties dry, which means the desire for moonshine stays high. But even beyond that, because they've got rid of Prohibition to tax people on alcohol, the price of alcohol goes through the roof. And a lot of people decide, I prefer just buying moonshine because it's cheaper. Yes. And so despite, if anything, the end of Prohibition, from 1934 through to about the 1950s, the moonshine industry and the bootleggers get bigger, not smaller.
Yeah, okay.
They all are making more money even after Prohibition because there are a lot of dry counties and it's so expensive. Yeah. So they're all going away from it. So this just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They reckon in the year that Prohibition ends, 35 million gallons of moonshine is being produced across the country. And just 1 million gallons are coming just from the foothills around Dawsonville, right, in Georgia, right? One retired Dawson bootlegger said virtually everyone in Dawson County was associated with the whiskey business in some way, right? So they keep trying to do this, and suddenly the big change, though, that happens in the 30s is, up to this point, the people policing this under Prohibition are police. But the minute it becomes legal to have alcohol, to stop the moonshine, which is only illegal now, not because it's alcohol, but because they're not paying tax, a whole body is set up through the tax office to purely catch moonshiners and the bootleggers who transport it. And this is where it becomes more and more problematic, because Junior Johnson said in Wilkes County, he said it became a federal thing, not a local sheriff thing. Yeah. So the local sheriff never tried to bust them. It was the feds. He said once he was driving and they were hauling liquor in his cars, and they came upon another car that had turned upside down in the ditch, and he went down to look at the wreck and found out it was the local sheriff and his partner who were drunk. And so he got him out and put him in the back of his car, which was full of moonshine, and dropped him at the hospital. And every time the sheriff saw him ever since, he'd just go, I hope you're not up to anything bad, and wouldn't look in the car. So there's a new unit, the alcohol tax unit in the IRS, and their whole job is to catch these, and they start recruiting state troopers, college athletes, and ex-soldiers. So people with no ties to the local area, right? And they all become known as revenuers. So their whole job is to track down or stop the revenue leaking. And in the South, in these areas, kids don't play cops and robbers. They play trippers and revenuers. Okay. So this is the game they play. Sure. To give you a sense, one guy, William Bernard Big Six Henderson, called Bill Six because of his 44 caliber pistol he always had, he was known for catching, he busted 5,000 stills and sent 5,600 moonshiners to jail. So you have this massive thing. So what you've got by the end of all this, and what we're building up to, is you suddenly have this cat and mouse game in the mountains, these people running moonshine, and these guys in these cars that are hotted up and delivered to the absolute thing. And what they suddenly realise, a few of them, is, why don't we, for fun, on the weekend,
get
together and race these cars and see who's the actual fastest? Because we all have these great stories of beating the revenue raisers, But is there a way we could actually just race against each other for fun?
Yeah.
And these guys start doing this. And soon, suddenly, people realise there is money to be made in racing these guys against each other. And this is what we'll cover in the next.
A new sport is born, or about to be born. That's a fascinating background to what is going to become a very exciting series. Well done.